In the summer of 1945, as the Pacific burned and empires crumbled under the weight of unprecedented destruction, the world approached a moment that would redraw its very foundations. Japan, once a rising imperial power, stretching across vast swaths of Asia and the Pacific, found itself surrounded, starving, and staring into the abyss. But the road to collapse did not begin with mushroom clouds or declarations of surrender. It began with a series of choices, battles, and beliefs, each carving away at the foundations of an empire that had once believed itself unshakable. This is the story of the final year of Imperial Japan, the year everything fell apart. The long shadow of war. By January 1945, the Pacific War had raged for more than 3.5 years. What had begun with stunning Japanese victories across Southeast Asia, the Philippines, and the Pacific Islands had reversed violently. The Allies, chiefly the United States, Britain, Australia, and China, were now pressing in on every front. Japan's once mighty combined fleet lay shattered, its air power devastated, its industries strained to the breaking point. Yet inside Japan, the leadership was not ready to surrender. According to historical records, Emperor Hirohito still hoped for a negotiated end to the conflict, one that might preserve the imperial system and avoid the humiliation of unconditional surrender. But even more influential than the emperor were the military hardliners, the army leadership that insisted Japan must fight on, regardless of the human cost. And so, the empire stood poised between reality and delusion, a nation on the edge. To understand the final collapse of Japan in 1945, we must first understand the state of the nation at the start of that year. The home islands were under siege not by invading armies, but by hunger, exhaustion, and the slow death of infrastructure. Bombed cities, breaking spirits. American B-29 super fortress bombers had begun large-scale raids the year before. But 1945 marked a terrifying new phase. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe cities that had stood for centuries were slowly transformed into smoldering plains of ruins. The firebombing of Tokyo in March would kill more people than the bombing of Hamburg or Dresden. And yet, for millions of Japanese civilians, that horror was still in the future. What existed already was fear. Fear of the droning engines overhead. Fear of dwindling food rations. Fear of a government that insisted everything was under control when nothing was. Even within Tokyo's highest halls of power, the truth was whispered, never spoken aloud. Japan could not win this war. The empire shrinks. The Philippines, a turning point. The collapse truly accelerated with the loss of the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur had returned, leading a massive Allied offensive to retake the strategic archipelago. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought in late 1944, effectively destroyed the remaining Japanese surface fleet. By early 1945, Japan's hold on the Philippines was broken. For the average soldier stationed there, surrender was not an option. Japanese military doctrine taught that surrender was dishonorable. Even in the face of certain death, many fought to the end. Others starved in the jungles, cut off from supply lines that no longer existed. One Japanese officer wrote in his final letter, "We have eaten roots and bark. We drink the rain. Yet, they tell us to fight. I do not know why we still fight." Losing the southern lifeline. The Philippines had been Japan's lifeline to the resources of Southeast Asia, rubber, oil, tin, and food. Losing it meant losing the ability to sustain war. Worse, American submarines prowled the waters between Japan and its remaining territories, sinking merchant ships faster than Japan could build them. By 1945, the empire was effectively starved of fuel. Every plane sent to battle was one Japan could barely afford. Every ship that sailed did so at the risk of never returning. Every tank that moved might be the last one with enough fuel to do so. The empire was bleeding out. The home front. Starvation and strain. The Japanese people had endured hardship since the war began, but 1945 brought suffering to an entirely new level. Food production had collapsed. Transport networks were mangled by bombings. Imports were almost non-existent. Families boiled weeds for soup. Children scoured fields for anything edible. According to the diaries of contemporary Japanese civilians, even middle-class families began slaughtering pets not out of cruelty, but out of desperation. Government propaganda versus reality. And yet, the government continued to feed the public miraculous promises about decisive battles that would drive the Americans back. Newspapers insisted victory was possible. Radio broadcasts trumpeted inevitable triumph. But ordinary people saw the truth with their own eyes every time they walked past a bombed-out neighborhood or stood in an endless ration line. Japan was losing, and the people knew it. The battle for Okinawa begins. If there was a single battle that symbolized Japan's unraveling, it was Okinawa. Why Okinawa mattered. Located just 340 miles from the Japanese mainland, Okinawa was the last major stepping stone before an Allied invasion of Japan itself. Both sides knew the stakes. American planners viewed Okinawa as essential. A base for the invasion of the home islands. An airfield for B-29 bombers. A staging ground for hundreds of thousands of troops. For Japan, losing Okinawa meant losing the ability to shield the mainland. The military high command prepared to defend it at any cost. Defenders prepared for death. According to Japanese military doctrine, Okinawa was to be defended to the last man. Civilians were not exempt from this mentality. Thousands were conscripted, pressed into service as laborers, or forced into mass suicides under the belief that Americans would commit atrocities if they surrendered. The seeds of tragedy were already sown. By the time American forces landed on Okinawa in April 1945, Japan was fighting not for victory, but for time. Time to negotiate. Time to maneuver diplomatically. Time to find any outcome other than unconditional surrender. The Japanese hoped their ferocious defense might convince the Allies to offer better terms. But the world had changed. The Allies had seen too much. The atrocities in China, the brutality of the Pacific campaigns, the near fanatical resistance at Iwo Jima. And with every new report, their willingness to compromise shrank. Cracks in the high command. Within Tokyo, the leaders of Japan were fracturing. The army versus the navy. The Japanese Navy knew the war was lost. After years of devastating losses and crippling supply shortages, many of its senior officers quietly advocated for surrender, though doing so publicly could mean assassination by extremists. The army, however, clung to the belief that a massive, decisive battle on the Japanese mainland could still turn the tide. Their logic was brutally simple. If enough Americans died in an invasion, President Truman might consider negotiations. This belief, militarily unrealistic and morally catastrophic, kept the war going month after month, even as Japan's cities were leveled. Emperor Hirohito, a silent figure in a storm. The emperor's role in 1945 remains debated by historians. What is widely agreed is that Hirohito was not the absolute dictator many outside observers imagined. The Japanese government operated through a complex web of councils, military factions, and bureaucratic authorities. Yet Hirohito's voice mattered. And as the months passed, he grew increasingly uneasy. In his palace diary, one advisor noted that the emperor appeared troubled after hearing reports of the firebombing of Tokyo. Another described him as grim after receiving updates on Okinawa. But unease did not translate to action. Not yet. Meanwhile, in America, across the Pacific, the United States was making preparations that would shape the final phase of the war and the world beyond it. The Manhattan Project, deep in the deserts of New Mexico and the laboratories of universities across the country, one of history's most secretive projects, was entering its final stages. The Manhattan Project. By early 1945, American scientists believed they were close to creating a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen, a bomb capable of unleashing apocalyptic destruction in an instant. But as General Leslie Groves and physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer moved toward a final test, The question loomed. Would the bomb be necessary to end the war? At this point, few in Allied leadership believed Japan would surrender without catastrophic force. The Soviet factor. Meanwhile, American diplomats were pressuring the Soviet Union to enter the war against Japan. At the Yalta Conference, Joseph Stalin agreed to declare war on Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. This timeline put Stalin's entry into the Pacific War around mid-August 1945. Little did anyone know. This decision would deal one of the final blows to Japan's hopes for negotiation. But that moment was still months away. For now, Japan faced an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. VEI. A nation waiting for disaster. As winter turned to spring in 1945, ordinary Japanese citizens lived in a strange duality. A world where daily life continued school, work, rituals, but one where annihilation felt closer with each air raid siren. B-29 seconds in the sky. The B-29 was unlike anything Japan had faced before. It flew higher, carried more bombs, and ranged farther than any bomber previously used in the Pacific. And by 1945, American airfields in the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were fully operational. Night after night, civilians watched streaks of fire descend from the sky. They listened to the distant thunder of explosions. Some prayed, some hid, some simply stared numbly into the darkness, too exhausted to feel fear anymore. A Tokyo survivor later recalled, "It was the sound more than the fire. The sky groaned as if the earth itself were being torn apart." This was the backdrop of daily life for millions. The Kamikaze gamble. As Japan's conventional military strength withered, the High Command turned to a tactic that shocked the world: the Kamikaze. Origins of the suicide attacks. The tactic emerged during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in late 1944, but by 1945 it had become a central part of Japan's defensive strategy. Young pilots, many barely trained, were ordered to crash their planes into Allied ships. Some volunteered out of nationalism or desperation. Others, according to later memoirs, felt enormous pressure to comply in a culture where refusal might be interpreted as cowardice. The attacks were devastating in their psychological impact, and they inflicted real damage, sinking or damaging dozens of ships. But they did not change the outcome of the war. To American commanders, the Kamikaze confirmed what they were already beginning to understand. Japan would resist to the last breath. And that realization led to another conclusion. An invasion of the Japanese home islands could be one of the bloodiest operations in history. The empire turns to dust. By mid-1945, Japan's situation had reached catastrophic levels. Factories stood idle due to lack of fuel. Railways collapsed under constant bombing. Children dug trenches instead of attending school. And yet, the leadership continued to speak of victory. The disconnect between reality and rhetoric widened into a chasm. One Japanese cabinet minister wrote in his diary, "We have lost the ability to fight, but the army will not admit it. They will drag us all into the grave." Within weeks, events would escalate faster than anyone expected, events that would force Japan to confront the unimaginable. Opening transition. The first months of 1945 shattered Japan's remaining illusions of control. Cities burned, soldiers starved, entire fleets vanished beneath black waves. Yet in the war rooms of Tokyo, behind closed doors and beneath portraits of emperors past the High Command clung to the belief that Japan could still force a negotiated peace. But as winter turned to spring, the most destructive aerial campaign in history was about to begin. And what followed would transform Japan beyond anything the world had ever seen. The night Tokyo burned. March 9-10, 1945. The firebombing of Tokyo. Shortly after midnight, the air above Tokyo began to hum. Some survivors said it was like hearing a swarm of distant insects. Others described it as the sky, vibrating like a drum. Then the noise grew louder and louder. American B-29 bombers, 325 of them, approached in waves, flying lower than usual. Their mission was not to destroy military targets. This was no precision strike. This was an operation designed to shatter a city's ability to function, to burn its heart out. The switch to incendiaries. General Curtis LeMay had decided to adopt a new strategy. Japan's wooden cities were vulnerable to fire. So instead of high-explosive bombs, the B-29 seconds carried napalm-filled incendiary canisters, M69 bomblets, that clung to surfaces and burned at temperatures beyond imagination. When the first cluster bombs dropped, they burst open over the densely packed city blocks of eastern Tokyo. Thousands of flaming sticks scattered like seeds, each one igniting as it struck roofs, walls, and streets. Within minutes, entire neighborhoods were on fire. Within hours, the firestorms joined. Hurricane-like winds roared through the streets, pulling oxygen into the flames and suffocating those who could not escape. Voices from the ground. According to survivor accounts, the heat grew so intense that metal melted, asphalt bubbled. People ran until their shoes disintegrated. Some jumped into canals, only to boil alive as the water superheated. One mother wrote in her diary, later recovered from the ruins. There was no night, only orange, only screams. When dawn broke, the scale of destruction was impossible to comprehend. Over 100,000 civilians were dead. Nearly 1 million were homeless. 16 square miles of Tokyo were reduced to ash. It was the single deadliest air raid in human history. A devastating message. For Japan's leaders, the Tokyo firebombing delivered a harsh truth. If the war continued, every major city might soon look like this. And yet, the government told the public the attack had been a setback, a lie nobody believed, a campaign of flames. Tokyo was only the beginning. The firebombing strategy expands. In the weeks following the Tokyo raid, General LeMay expanded the incendiary campaign. City after city became a target. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, Toyama, Fukuoka. Some were industrial hubs, others were simply population centers. In each case, the result was the same: devastation. By June 1945, more than 40% of the urban area of Japan's largest cities had been incinerated. According to post-war analyses, at least 350,000 civilians died in these raids, though the true toll may be far higher. Civilians caught in the inferno. Air raid shelters overflowed. Families dug shallow trenches in backyards, hoping soil could shield them from napalm. Children wore protective hoods soaked in water. Women carried bundles of belongings, wrapped in damp towels. But nothing stopped the flames. Firefighters, brave but desperately under-equipped, faced walls of fire with hand pumps and buckets. In some cases, entire firefighting crews vanished. The disconnect grows. Despite the devastation, the Japanese government continued to issue messages, insisting the war was under control. Newspapers praised glorious sacrifices. Radio broadcasts claimed Japan had secret weapons, ready to turn the tide. But the people knew better. Every smoking ruin contradicted the official narrative. Japan's leaders were losing not just the war, but the trust of their own people. The Okinawa nightmare. While Japan's cities burned, an even bloodier tragedy unfolded on Okinawa, the last major island before the mainland. The American landing. The 1st of April, 1945. On Easter Sunday, American troops, U.S. Army, and Marines landed on Okinawa's beaches. It was one of the largest amphibious assaults in history. Nearly 180,000 American forces took part. But unlike previous battles, the Japanese defenders did not rush to the beaches. General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the 32nd Army, had developed a new strategy. A deep defensive network, hidden in the southern hills, the Shuri Line. Instead of wasting lives in futile banzai charges, the Japanese would fight a grinding battle of attrition. The hellish terrain. The Shuri Line was a labyrinth of fortifications, tunnels carved into limestone, bunkers interconnected by underground passages, artillery hidden in caves, trenches woven through jagged hills. It was a nightmare for the attackers. American troops described caves that seemed to extend endlessly. Machine gun nests appeared suddenly. Snipers fired from unseen angles. Rain turned the battlefield into rivers of mud. Bodies, American, Japanese, and civilian, lay half-buried in the muck. Flies swarmed. The stench was unbearable. Civilian tragedy. Perhaps the most heartbreaking element was the presence of Okinawan civilians, caught between two armies, often coerced by Japanese troops into supporting the defense. Many were convinced through propaganda and terror that American soldiers would torture or kill them if they surrendered. This fear led to mass suicides, families throwing themselves off cliffs, using grenades distributed by the Japanese military, or committing self-inflicted violence to avoid capture. Later investigations revealed that many civilians likely would have survived had they been allowed to surrender. The Soviet shadow. While Japan struggled to hold back the Americans, a new danger gathered in the north. Japan's last hope, Moscow. For months, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo had urged the government to reach out to the Soviet Union. Japan hoped the USSR might mediate a peace treaty between Japan and the Allies. But this hope relied on a disastrous miscalculation. At the Yalta Conference earlier that year, Joseph Stalin had already promised the Allies that the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan 3 months after the defeat of Nazi Germany. That deadline fell on August 8-9, 1945. Japan had no idea that the clock was already ticking toward disaster. Soviet military preparations. Throughout the spring of 1945, the USSR quietly shifted its massive armies eastward. Veterans of the battles of Berlin, Stalingrad, and Kursk. While Tokyo interpreted Soviet silence as diplomatic restraint, Moscow was preparing to launch one of the largest offensives in the history of warfare. The invasion of Manchuria. The people's suffering deepens. As leaders debated surrender or resistance, ordinary Japanese citizens faced a reality far more immediate: the collapse of daily life. By May 1945, food rations had fallen to starvation levels. Black markets became the only source of many staples. Transportation was crippled by bomb damage. Water and electricity in major cities often failed for days. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Families cooked meals of wild grasses and acorns. Schools burned in raids. Hospitals overflowed with burn victims. In some regions, police reported rising deaths from malnutrition, particularly among children and the elderly. The air raids intensify. The Americans continued their relentless bombing campaign. In some cities, there were no more targets left to destroy. Toyama, for instance, was 99.5% destroyed. One American pilot recalled looking down at the smoldering ruins and thinking, there is nothing left that a bomb could hit. The air war had moved beyond strategic bombing. It was now a campaign to crush Japan's ability and will to resist, the war that must not be lost. And yet, in the military high command, surrender remained unthinkable. Operation Ketsugo, the last stand. The Army's plan for the defense of Japan was staggering. Mobilize over 2.3 million soldiers, many poorly equipped. Arm civilians with bamboo spears and hunting rifles. Train school children to act as human mines under tanks. Convert small aircraft into kamikaze gliders. Fortify beaches with hidden bunkers and minefields. Japan was prepared to turn its home islands into a massive killing ground. Historians later analyzed the logistics and concluded the truth. Japan had neither the weapons, ammunition, nor fuel to make this plan viable. But the army believed conviction could substitute for firepower. The cabinet splits further. Every day brought more disagreements. Should Japan negotiate via the Soviets? Should they launch a final defense and hope for better terms? Should the war continue until the homeland was invaded? The only point of agreement was tragic. Unconditional surrender was unacceptable. Truman takes office. Meanwhile, in Washington, the United States underwent a sudden transformation. The 12th of April 1945, Roosevelt dies. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had led the nation through the Depression and nearly the entirety of World War II, died unexpectedly. Vice President Harry S. Truman was sworn in, with little preparation for the monumental decisions ahead. He was briefed on the Manhattan Project only after taking office. The debate inside Washington. Truman's military advisors believed Japan would fight to the bitter end, just as they had on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Some urged the president to prepare for a full-scale invasion Operation Downfall, which could require millions of American troops. Others pointed to the atomic bomb as a potential alternative, but the bomb was not yet ready. Untested, unproven. The Trinity test would not take place until July. Until then, the war raged on. The war of choice ends. By the summer of 1945, Japan's leaders were trapped by their own contradictions. They wished for peace but feared surrender. They prepared for defense but lacked the means to fight. They hoped for Soviet mediation while unknowingly facing impending Soviet invasion. The result was paralysis while the country bled. Civilians lose hope. Letters from civilians in mid-1945 paint a bleak picture. We no longer fear death. We fear the suffering before death. The sky is always black with smoke. There is no blue anymore. The government tells us to be brave, but bravery cannot feed a child. By July, even the emperor privately admitted that the war must end somehow. But how? The storm before the break. As June bled into July, Japan's collapse accelerated. American forces close in. After Okinawa, the U.S. prepared for future operations. Airfields built to support invasion forces. Naval fleets repositioned around the home islands. 29 raids launching almost daily. Mining operations choking Japan's remaining ports. By July, Japan was nearly cut off from the outside world. The Potsdam Declaration. On the 26th of July 1945, the Allies issued a statement demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. It promised prompt and utter destruction if Japan refused. Japan's response? Silence. And behind that silence, internal chaos. The government could not agree on how to respond. Some wanted to accept, some wanted to reject. Most simply hesitated, paralyzed by fear of backlash. The clock runs out. The world was about to enter August, and in August 1945, everything would change. Forever.